This is why the empath's silence is the loudest revenge depth psychology explained. There comes a moment when the empath doesn't cry, doesn't explain, doesn't argue, they just disappear. It's not coldness, it's not revenge, it's the moment their soul reclaims its power. Jung called this process individuation, the sacred act of separating from illusion to return to one's true self. This is what really happens when an empath deletes you not from their phone, but from their entire energetic field. And once it happens, there's no going back. Part 1. The psychological breaking point when the empath reaches the limit. There comes a moment in every empath's life when something inside of them collapses silently but completely. It's not an explosion, it's an implosion of everything they once believed about love, loyalty, and the power of understanding others. For years, the empath has carried the emotional weight of those around them, often confusing compassion with responsibility. They've absorbed every wound, every unspoken sorrow, every manipulation disguised as need. Yet Jung reminds us that the psyche is a living system with boundaries. Even the kindest soul will eventually reach a psychological breaking point, the threshold where the conscious mind can no longer suppress the truth buried in the unconscious. From a Jungian perspective, this collapse is not a failure. It's the moment when the psyche begins to defend itself. Jung wrote that what we resist persists. The empath's tendency to resist conflict, to avoid hurting others, to absorb negativity rather than return it, eventually makes their inner world toxic. The unconscious, in turn, begins to revolt. The dreams of the empath become darker, their body starts to ache, their intuition becomes restless. They no longer feel the same joy when giving, nor the same peace when forgiving. Their system begins to whisper enough. Jung would call this the activation of the shadow, the moment the repressed self demands acknowledgement. The empath, who has spent years identifying with the archetype of the healer, must now face the parts of themselves they've neglected: anger, exhaustion, resentment, and the primal instinct to protect their own boundaries. This confrontation with the shadow is not gentle. It feels like betrayal, not from others, but from within. At first, the empath tries harder. They overextend, even more convinced that love can heal everything. But according to Jung, this is a dangerous form of ego inflation. The empath unconsciously begins to believe they possess a divine power to redeem broken people. They see their compassion as limitless, an illusion that keeps them trapped. The more they give, the more they are drained, and the less they recognize themselves. They lose the distinction between self and other, between empathy and self-erasure. This loss of boundaries is deeply psychological. In Jungian terms, the empath becomes enmeshed. Their ego dissolves into the emotional field of another person, usually a narcissist or a deeply wounded soul. The relationship becomes symbolic of the inner conflict between light and shadow. The empath represents the conscious ego, while the narcissist embodies the unconscious shadow, the denied aspects of power, control, and egoism that the empath has repressed. In this dynamic, both are unconsciously drawn together by what Jung called the law of psychic compensation. The empath's excessive light attracts the darkness of another, and the narcissist's emptiness feeds on the empath's fullness. The relationship is not random, it's archetypal. It mirrors the ancient myth of the healer who must heal themselves through the suffering they witness. But the psyche, though compassionate, is not foolish. It knows balance must be restored. Over time, the empath's inner self begins to reclaim control. The body becomes the messenger. Anxiety, fatigue, physical pain, or emotional numbness all appear as signals from the unconscious that the psyche's energy has been misdirected. Jung described this as the autonomous reaction of the unconscious, the psyche's natural attempt to restore equilibrium. The empath, who once believed that loving harder would fix things, starts to feel something new: detachment. At first they confuse it with apathy, but it's not. It's the beginning of self-preservation. This detachment is the soul's way of retreating from the battlefield to survive. In Jung's model, this process is the ego withdrawing its projections. The empath no longer projects the image of goodness, purity, or redemption onto the other person. They begin to see reality as it is stripped of illusion. This is one of the most painful psychological moments in an empath's life. To withdraw projection is to dismantle a fantasy. It means admitting that the person they tried to save is not what they imagined. It means facing the truth that love without mutual awareness becomes self-destruction. Jung wrote that every projection, once withdrawn, leaves behind a piece of the soul because what we see in others always comes from ourselves. So when the empath begins to see clearly, they grieve. They grieve not only the person who hurt them, but also the version of themselves who tolerated the pain. They grieve the illusion of harmony that was never real. The empathy that once felt divine now feels like a curse. They question everything: their worth, their kindness, their intuition. But this grief is sacred. It is the ego disintegrating so that the true self can emerge. Jung emphasized that the self, the center of the total psyche, seeks wholeness, not comfort. Wholeness requires confrontation with opposites. For the empath, the opposite of compassion is self-assertion. The opposite of forgiveness is boundary. The opposite of understanding is truth. When these opposites collide, the empath experiences what Jung called enantiodromia, the natural reversal of energies. What was once overdeveloped, empathy gives way to what was suppressed self-protection. This reversal is not instantaneous. The empath resists it because it feels unnatural to say no. Their conditioning tells them that withholding love equals cruelty. But the unconscious disagrees. It pushes them toward individuation, the process of becoming an integrated whole being rather than a fragmented one. Every act of saying no becomes a declaration of identity. Every act of withdrawal becomes an act of self-respect. At this point, the empath's environment may react violently. Narcissistic individuals sense the shift immediately. They panic, guilt trip, or attempt to re-establish emotional control, but something fundamental has changed. The empath's energy no longer flows outward. It begins to flow inward toward healing, reflection, and self-understanding. This is when Jung's theory of psychic compensation fully manifests. The unconscious had to create chaos so that consciousness could awaken. The empath's collapse was not punishment, but initiation. In ancient Jungian symbolism, this stage corresponds to the night sea journey, the descent into darkness that precedes transformation. The empath, having lost everything familiar, begins to see the outlines of their true self in the dark. They start noticing how much of their identity was built around others' needs. Every memory, every decision, every habit of emotional caretaking becomes suspect. They realize that their so-called kindness was often a strategy to avoid rejection, that their ability to feel others' pain was sometimes a defense mechanism to avoid facing their own. Jung would say they were living under the domination of a complex, specifically the savior complex. This complex operates autonomously, compelling the empath to rescue, heal, and fix, even when it destroys them. Breaking this complex requires enormous psychic energy. It feels brutal because it is a death, the death of an identity built on martyrdom. Jung described such psychic deaths as necessary precursors to rebirth. The empath's exhaustion, their silence, their withdrawal from others are not signs of weakness but symptoms of metamorphosis. As the empath steps away from the toxic dynamic, their unconscious begins to release suppressed material, repressed anger, unmet needs, unresolved grief. These emotions surface with intensity, often through dreams or spontaneous emotional outbursts. Jung advised that such eruptions should not be suppressed but integrated. Each emotion, once acknowledged, becomes part of the new personality structure. The empath begins to rediscover pieces of themselves that were sacrificed in the name of love, ambition, creativity, assertiveness, even a healthy degree of selfishness. They start to understand that boundaries are not walls but sacred containers of energy. In Jungian terms, they are reclaiming their libido, the life force that had been unconsciously projected onto others. At this stage, solitude becomes both terrifying and liberating. The empath feels lost without someone to care for, yet they also sense an emerging inner clarity. Jung observed that when the ego detaches from projection, it experiences psychic withdrawal, a necessary step in individuation. The empath learns to observe rather than absorb. They learn to listen without rescuing. They learn that compassion without discernment is self-sabotage. As the empath's awareness deepens, their perception of others changes dramatically. They begin to see through manipulation that once confused them. The subtle guilt tactics, emotional games, and energy siphoning no longer work. Jung would interpret this as the ego regaining sovereignty. The empath's psychic boundaries are no longer porous. They have become conscious and therefore powerful. But this awareness also brings loneliness. The empath realizes how many of their relationships were built on unspoken dependency. When they stop overgiving, people withdraw. This is one of the hardest realizations. Most of what they called connection was actually emotional labor. Jung described individuation as a path of solitude, not isolation, because one must walk alone to find the self. During this period, the empath's inner dialogue transforms. Instead of asking, "How can I make them understand me?" they ask, "Why did I need them to understand me at all?" This is a shift from external validation to internal meaning. Jung called it the transition from ego consciousness to self-consciousness, a higher form of awareness in which one recognizes their divine autonomy. The breaking point then is not a breakdown, it's the dismantling of illusion. The empath learns that their energy is sacred, not infinite, that not everyone deserves access to their inner world, that saving others is impossible when one is drowning. The unconscious, in its infinite wisdom, orchestrates this collapse to redirect the soul toward authenticity. In Jungian symbolism, this marks the passage from the persona, the social mask, to the true self. The empath's persona was the good one, the caretaker, the listener. But now that mask cracks, revealing a deeper layer of truth. They are not just a giver, they are a being of depth with desires, anger, and dignity. The moment of breaking is brutal, precisely because it destroys the false peace the empath lived in. It exposes the shadow of their kindness, the hidden pride, the need to be needed, the fear of abandonment. Jung believed that consciousness grows only through suffering that reveals contradiction. When the empath sees that their love was partly an unconscious attempt to control outcomes, to avoid pain, to earn safety, they begin to awaken. The unconscious no longer supports the old narrative. Dreams begin to shift. The empath dreams of doors closing, of cleaning, of storms clearing the air. Symbolically, these are images of purification and release. The psyche communicates through symbols, and each dream tells the empath, "You are leaving the old world behind." Then something profound happens: silence. The empath, who once filled every void with words, care, or understanding, stops explaining. This silence is not passive. It's sacred. It's the psyche's way of reclaiming energy that was once scattered. Jung considered silence a manifestation of psychic containment, the ability to hold tension without impulsive reaction. This marks emotional maturity. In daily life, this looks like emotional neutrality. The empath no longer reacts to provocation. They stop defending their intentions. They no longer chase closure. Jung might describe this as the beginning of psychological detachment, not from love but from illusion. The empath begins to feel lighter, clearer, calmer. The external world may perceive this as coldness, but in truth it's the warmth of inner peace. The empath has ceased identifying with their pain. They've accepted that not everyone wants healing. Some people need their chaos more than they need connection. This realization is painful but freeing. It marks the birth of discernment, the ability to see without judgment. Jung saw discernment as a spiritual function of consciousness, a sign that the self is now in command. The empath no longer divides the world into victims and villains. They see patterns, projections, archetypes. They see that everyone, including themselves, is acting out an inner drama, seeking resolution. At this point, the empath begins to integrate the archetype of the wise healer, a more balanced version of their earlier self. The wise healer loves without attachment, helps without depletion, listens without absorbing. This is the psychological maturity that comes only after the breaking point. In Jungian psychology, every wound carries within it the seed of transformation. The empath's breaking point was the wound of awakening the psyche's violent but necessary correction toward wholeness. Once the empath reaches this stage deletion, the act of cutting someone off is not revenge, it's restoration. But that is the next phase of the journey. For now, the breaking point stands as the sacred threshold, the end of one illusion and the beginning of true selfhood. Part 2. The shadow awakens, confronting the dark truth. When an empath reaches the breaking point, something ancient stirs within something they've spent their entire life trying to suppress: the shadow. Jung described the shadow as the sum of all traits, emotions, and impulses that our conscious ego refuses to acknowledge. For an empath, this shadow is not made of malice or cruelty, but of suppressed strength. It is the unexpressed no, the anger that was swallowed, the boundaries that were never defended, the truth that was buried under kindness. To the empath, the awakening of the shadow feels like a betrayal of their identity. For years, they've defined themselves by goodness, by being the calm in the storm, the light in someone else's darkness. But when the shadow awakens, that light flickers. The empath begins to feel rage, contempt, even hatred toward the person who used them. These feelings terrify them. They don't recognize themselves. They think they're becoming like the narcissist. But Jung would say otherwise. This is not corruption, it's integration. The empath's rage is not evil. It's ancient self-respect rising from the depths. It's the unconscious correcting an imbalance that's lasted far too long. Jung said one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The empath's darkness is their repressed instinct, the power to defend, to detach, to stop giving. It was denied because the ego identified only with the image of the good one. Now the psyche demands wholeness. The empath must see themselves not as a savior, but as a complete human being, capable of both tenderness and fury, compassion and distance. When the shadow first emerges, it's messy. The empath might lash out, cry uncontrollably, or isolate themselves completely. This emotional chaos is not regression, it's psychic detox. The psyche is purging illusions, burning away false identities. The empath's tears are the body's way of dissolving attachments that no longer serve the soul. In Jungian depth psychology, the shadow always appears when the ego's identity is too one-sided. For the empath, that one-sidedness is the belief that love is always the answer. The unconscious knows this isn't true. Love without boundaries isn't divine, it's destructive. The shadow arrives to restore balance. It whispers, "Enough." This awakening often feels like a dark night of the soul. The empath no longer trusts their intuition. Their sense of reality collapses because the very foundation of their personality, the need to help, to understand, to fix, is being dismantled. Jung described this as psychic disorientation, the moment when consciousness loses its old reference points. The ego, deprived of its former identity, experiences emptiness. But this void is sacred. It's the womb of transformation. The empath begins to see that their relationship with the narcissist was never about the narcissist alone. It was an external projection of an inner drama, the war between their light and their shadow. The narcissist played the role of their denied self, the assertive, self-centered, unapologetic part that the empath rejected within themselves. Jung called this the projection of the shadow onto others. The more the empath despised the narcissist's arrogance, the more it revealed how deeply they had repressed their own assertiveness. To withdraw that projection is painful because it requires humility. The empath must admit that the qualities they hate in others also exist within them, though buried, denied, and moralized out of existence. But this confrontation is liberating. Once the empath sees that their inner darkness is not evil but human, their energy begins to shift. The hatred they felt toward the other person transforms into understanding, not forgiveness born of naivety, but wisdom born of clarity. The empath's shadow also exposes the hidden motives behind their compassion. Jung argued that no act is purely selfless. Every action carries unconscious motives. The empath realizes that part of their giving came from fear, the fear of being unwanted, the fear of abandonment, the fear of being seen as unkind. Their empathy was at times a strategy for control, a way to secure safety by being indispensable. This recognition shatters their self-image, but it's the only way to attain authentic love. The shadow's awakening is not about becoming less kind. It's about becoming conscious of why we're kind. The empath begins to differentiate between compassion born of strength and compassion born of fear. The former is selfless. The latter is self-erasing. Jung would say that consciousness itself is moral. The act of becoming aware redeems the behavior. This awareness changes the empath's emotional landscape. They stop seeking to be understood by those who refuse to listen. They no longer beg for closure because they understand that closure is an internal process. The shadow teaches them that not everyone deserves their empathy, and that saying no can be an act of profound love for both parties. At this point, the empath's inner dialogue changes tone. The old voice, the one that said, "Be patient, they're just hurt," is replaced by another, "They're hurt, but so are you." This is the voice of the self, the center of Jung's psychological system. The self represents totality. It wants balance, not martyrdom. Every time the empath honors their limits, the self grows stronger. Every time they protect their peace, their consciousness expands. The shadow's awakening also brings a wave of memories. The empath starts recalling childhood moments when their sensitivity was punished or exploited. They remember being told, "You're too emotional, you overreact, be nice." These early experiences conditioned them to suppress their instinctive reactions in order to survive. Jung would call this a complex, a cluster of emotions and memories charged with psychic energy. The nice person complex becomes the empath's operating system. It keeps them compliant, gentle, and self-sacrificing until the shadow breaks the code. As these memories resurface, the empath experiences both sorrow and rage. They begin to see how their adult relationships mirrored their earliest attachments. The narcissist wasn't the first to invalidate them. They were reenacting an old wound, trying unconsciously to heal it through repetition. Jung named this process the repetition compulsion, the psyche's attempt to repair trauma by recreating it in new forms. Once the empath recognizes the pattern, they can finally break it. This recognition marks a turning point. The empath stops romanticizing pain. They stop interpreting suffering as a sign of depth or spiritual superiority. Instead, they begin to see that constant sacrifice is not virtue but conditioning. Jung believed that true transformation begins when we stop idealizing our wounds. The shadow teaches the empath that healing doesn't mean being endlessly forgiving. It means reclaiming the parts of the self that were exiled. In this phase, the empath also confronts their repressed anger, an emotion they've long considered taboo. Anger has always been the language of their shadow, but they silenced it to stay lovable. Now it erupts. It doesn't come as polite irritation. It's volcanic, raw, and purifying. Jung viewed anger as a numinous force energy charged with meaning. When expressed consciously, it restores integrity to the psyche. The empath learns to channel this anger not toward revenge, but towards self-assertion. They begin to make choices that honor their energy rather than deplete it. They cancel plans that feel draining. They end conversations that cross boundaries. They walk away without guilt. Each act of self-respect strengthens their psychological container. But this awakening also isolates them. The empath's newfound boundaries disturb those who benefited from their lack of them. Some accuse them of being cold, selfish, or ungrateful. But this projection from others is proof that the empath's shadow work is succeeding. Jung noted that when a person integrates their shadow, the collective around them often resists. The environment mirrors the inner transformation and tests its authenticity. The empath must learn to hold this tension. They can't retreat into old habits, nor can they swing to the opposite extreme of apathy. Jung warned against identifying with the shadow, which can lead to cynicism or cruelty. The goal is integration, to be conscious of both light and dark, not dominated by either. In this balancing act, solitude becomes sacred. The empath spends more time alone, not as avoidance, but as communion with their deeper self. They begin journaling, meditating, or simply observing their thoughts without judgment. The inner world becomes richer, more vivid. Jung would describe this as dialogue with the unconscious, where the ego listens instead of dictates. Through this inner dialogue, the empath discovers something unexpected: forgiveness, but not the sentimental kind. This forgiveness is not for the other person, it's for themselves. It's the forgiveness of their own blindness, their own denial, their own complicity in their pain. Jung emphasized that healing requires self-compassion, not self-condemnation. The empath realizes they were not weak. They were human, trying to love from a place of unhealed love. The shadow's awakening also transforms the empath's perception of evil. They stop seeing narcissists as monsters and begin understanding them as psychologically fragmented beings. This doesn't excuse their actions but reframes them. The empath recognizes that what the narcissist lacks, empathy, is precisely what they themselves overextended. Both extremes are symptoms of imbalance. This understanding allows the empath to detach with clarity, not bitterness. In Jungian terms, this is transcendence of the opposites, the ability to hold light and dark in the same consciousness without collapsing into either. The empath becomes capable of seeing the narcissist as both wounded and accountable, human yet harmful. This is true spiritual maturity. With the shadow now integrated, the empath's emotional responses change dramatically. They no longer absorb other people's moods. Their sensitivity remains, but it's no longer porous. Jung would say their psychic boundaries have solidified. They feel deeply but selectively. They can walk into a room full of chaos and remain centered. This is the psychological armor that only self-awareness can build. The empath's communication style also evolves. They speak with calm assertiveness instead of emotional pleading. Their words carry weight because they're backed by self-respect. They stop over-explaining or justifying their feelings. This newfound voice is the manifestation of their shadow's power transformed into consciousness. Internally, they start experiencing synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that Jung believed were signs of alignment between the conscious and unconscious. They might repeatedly see symbols of rebirth: butterflies, phoenixes, storms clearing, all reminders that transformation is underway. The psyche speaks in symbols, and now the empath can finally understand its language. The most profound shift, however, is spiritual. The empath realizes that their pain was not meaningless. It was the vehicle through which their consciousness expanded. The shadow's awakening was not punishment. It was initiation. They were never victims, they were apprentices of the soul. Jung wrote that there is no coming to consciousness without pain. The empath now understands this viscerally. They also begin to reclaim joy, not the naive joy of denial, but the quiet joy of authenticity. It's the relief of no longer pretending to be endlessly good. It's the peace that comes from living truthfully, even when that truth costs relationships. Jung considered authenticity a form of moral courage, the highest expression of individuality. The empath's interactions become more genuine. They're no longer drawn to chaos or emotional intensity. They seek stillness, mutuality, and depth. They stop chasing people who drain them. They choose reciprocity over fantasy. The unconscious no longer compels them towards suffering because its message has been delivered. By now, the empath has begun to embody the archetype of the warrior healer, the one who heals through boundaries, not through sacrifice. The shadow is no longer an enemy, it's an ally. It whispers wisdom. You are not meant to save others. You are meant to understand yourself. This awareness radiates outward. People sense the empath's shift even if they can't name it. Their energy feels grounded, magnetic, untouchable. Jung would describe this as the emergence of the individuated personality, someone who is psychologically whole, no longer defined by others' projections. The shadow's integration also changes the empath's creative and spiritual expression. They might write, paint, teach, or help others from a place of wholeness rather than need. Their compassion now has discernment. Their love has edges. Their light, having gone through darkness, now carries depth. The empath no longer confuses peace with silence. They understand that true peace sometimes requires confrontation. They've learned to say hard truths without cruelty, to walk away without resentment, to end cycles without explanation. This is the mature form of empathy, empathy with consciousness. In Jung's framework, the empath has moved from sentimental morality to psychological morality. Instead of obeying external rules of goodness, they follow the inner law of authenticity. Their decisions are guided not by fear of judgment, but by alignment with the self. The dark truth the empath confronts is simple yet life-changing. Not everyone wants to be healed and trying to save. Those who resist change is a form of self-abandonment. This truth is brutal because it dismantles the empath's entire identity. But once they accept it, they become free. The shadow taught them that love without awareness is bondage. Compassion without boundary is self-destruction. Healing begins not when they change others, but when they stop betraying themselves. And in that silence, when the noise of guilt, duty, and illusion fades, the empath hears something they've never heard before: their own voice. It's steady, calm, and wise. It doesn't beg or justify. It simply says, "I am enough." That's the sound of the shadow bowing to the self the moment the empath steps into their true power. Part 3. Jung's Erasure Psychology, the act of deletion as individuation. When an empath finally deletes someone from their life, it appears outwardly as an act of cold detachment. But in Jungian terms, it is one of the most profound psychological rituals a person can perform. A sacred act of individuation where the soul separates from illusions that once enslaved it. What looks like erasure on the surface is in reality an internal purification. The psyche, reclaiming its own energy from projections, trauma bonds, and unintegrated archetypes. Jung understood that relationships are not merely social bonds, they are psychic mirrors. Every attachment carries unconscious meaning. When an empath forms a deep connection with someone who drains them, it is rarely accidental. It is an energetic contract between the conscious and the unconscious, played out through two human beings. The empath becomes the vessel for compassion, while the other often becomes the vessel for control or need. These roles are archetypal, ancient, and profoundly magnetic. But when one awakens, when consciousness finally sees the pattern, the game collapses. That collapse is what Jung would call psychological separation, or what we now describe as deletion. Deletion is not vengeance. It is a statement from the self to the ego. The lesson is complete. The empath doesn't delete a person because they stopped caring. They delete them because they finally see with devastating clarity that continued connection sustains a wound that refuses to heal. It is the psyche's act of self-protection, but deeper still, it is a spiritual boundary erected by the unconscious itself. Jung would say that the self intervenes when the ego refuses to change. Before this act of erasure happens, there's often a long inner struggle. The empath debates endlessly. Maybe they'll change. Maybe I should be more understanding. Maybe I'm being too cold. But beneath those thoughts lies a quiet revolt within the psyche. The unconscious, which has tolerated imbalance for too long, begins to dismantle the illusion of connection piece by piece. It sends signals, loss of emotional resonance, exhaustion after each interaction, even physical symptoms. Jung emphasized that the unconscious communicates through the body as much as through dreams. When the empath starts to feel sick around someone they once adored, it's not coincidence, it's communication. At this stage, the empath's libido, their psychic life energy, has shifted direction. It no longer flows toward the other, it turns inward. Jung considered this withdrawal of libido a defining moment in individuation. The person who once lived for others begins to live from the self. The act of deletion is simply the outer manifestation of this inner reorientation. From the outside, deletion seems abrupt, even brutal, but psychologically it's the culmination of years of silent suffering. The empath has tried every path: understanding, forgiveness, compromise, reasoning. Nothing worked because the problem was never in behavior. It was in energetic imbalance. The relationship thrived on asymmetry, one giving, one taking, one seeing, one being blind. When the empath deletes, they are not abandoning the person, they are abandoning the dynamic. Jung would say they are withdrawing from the archetypal field that kept them trapped. Jung's erasure psychology can be understood through his concept of enantiodromia, the turning of things into their opposite. When a pattern reaches its extreme, it collapses under its own weight. The empath's endless giving transforms into radical withdrawal. The same energy that once sustained connection now fuels separation. It is the psyche's way of restoring balance. Erasure, then, is not emotional cruelty, it is psychic justice. At the moment of deletion, something remarkable happens inside the empath silence. No dramatic farewell, no explanations, no confrontation, just absence. Jung described this silence as the beginning of psychic containment, the ability to hold tension without acting impulsively. It marks a level of psychological maturity that only comes from deep suffering. The empath has learned that speaking truth to someone who lives in denial is futile. Silence becomes the language of boundaries. In Jung's framework, this silence also symbolizes withdrawal of projection. As long as the empath stayed connected, they were projecting their own inner healer, savior, or nurturer onto the other person. That projection gave the relationship meaning. Once it is withdrawn, the illusion dissolves. The empath sees the other as they truly are not a soul to be fixed, but an autonomous being whose path is separate. This is painful but liberating. To delete someone is to delete the fantasy that you could save them. Erasure, then, is an act of mourning. The empath grieves not only the person, but the version of themselves that existed in that relationship. The caretaker, the fixer, the one who believed love could rewrite trauma. Jung saw this grieving as part of the individuation process. The ego must die to its old identity before it can evolve. The deletion marks that death. The empath's new life begins in the ashes of what was once their purpose. But why does deletion feel so violent even when it's necessary? Because the psyche resists disconnection the same way the body resists amputation. Jung explained that the psyche is inherently relational. It seeks unity, wholeness, connection. Cutting ties feels like tearing fabric from the soul. Yet this pain is redemptive, for it forces the empath to face their dependency on others for meaning. When they delete, they're not just removing a person. They're severing an internal pattern of self-betrayal. In depth psychological terms, deletion represents differentiation of the ego from the complex. The empath's savior complex, a constellation of guilt, need, and altruism, has dominated their psychic system. Through deletion, the ego reclaims sovereignty. It says, I am not your healer, your mirror, or your emotional sponge. I am myself. This declaration marks a quantum leap in consciousness. There is also a spiritual dimension to this act. Jung viewed individuation as not only psychological but sacred. Each person carries within them a divine spark, the self that seeks realization. When an empath deletes someone, it's often because that relationship blocked the expression of the self. They were living in service to another's unconscious rather than their own wholeness. Deletion clears the channel. It is symbolically an exorcism of energetic entanglement. The aftermath of erasure is paradoxical. There's relief, but also emptiness. The empath may feel guilt for being too harsh or nostalgia for the moments that felt real. But Jung taught that the unconscious compensates for all one-sided emotions. The guilt is simply the residue of the old identity still dying. Over time, it fades as the psyche stabilizes in its new alignment. The emptiness, too, is sacred. It's the space where the new self begins to breathe. The empath begins to notice how their energy feels lighter. They sleep better. Their creativity returns. The silence that once felt unbearable becomes comforting. Jung might call this the return of the libido. The life energy that had been bound to another's psychic orbit now flows freely again. This energy fuels individuation, the process by which one becomes whole. The empath, once drained, begins to feel their soul again. Yet there is another deeper layer to Erasure: psychological cleansing of archetypal possession. When an empath is trapped in a toxic dynamic, they are often under the spell of an archetype, most commonly the wounded healer or the redeemer. These archetypes, while noble, can possess the ego. They whisper, "Your love will fix them. Your patience will save them." Jung warned that archetypes are powerful energies that can both elevate and destroy. Deletion, in this sense, is the ego reclaiming itself from archetypal possession. It's the refusal to play a cosmic role that no longer serves growth. After deletion, the empath may feel disoriented. They've lived so long in emotional high alert that peace feels foreign. This is the detox phase, the nervous system recalibrating after years of psychic overstimulation. Jung described this recalibration as the withdrawal of emotional inflation. The ego, having deflated from its savior fantasy, must now exist in reality. Reality feels quieter, smaller, but infinitely more authentic. It's at this stage that dreams often become vivid. The unconscious celebrates the act of deletion through symbolism: doors closing, snakes, shedding skin, rivers flowing again. These images reflect the psyche's renewal. The empath, now aligned with their self, receives these messages not as warnings but as affirmations. The psyche is saying, "You did what was necessary." The physical environment also begins to shift. The empath may notice that new people enter their life calmer, healthier, more self-aware individuals. This is not coincidence. Jung emphasized that the outer world mirrors the inner world. Once the empath deletes the internal pattern that attracted toxicity, their external world reorganizes. Synchronicities appear, opportunities emerge, life itself responds to the clearing. In Jungian psychology, this moment marks the transition from projection to participation. The empath stops projecting inner material onto others and begins participating consciously in relationships. They no longer see love as sacrifice but as mutual expansion. The energy once wasted on fixing others becomes the energy of creation. Many empaths discover new talents during this phase: writing, art, healing, teaching, because the libido that was once bound in pain now seeks expression through purpose. Still, the old identity sometimes tries to return. The empath might feel the urge to check in on the person they deleted to make sure they're okay. But the unconscious knows this urge is not compassion, it's temptation. It's the ego's attempt to re-enter the old dynamic because chaos once felt familiar. Jung would say this is the shadow of nostalgia, a final test before integration. True freedom lies in resisting it. One of Jung's most powerful insights was that individuation is circular, not linear. The empath may revisit the old pattern in subtler forms. They may attract people who resemble the one they deleted, but this time awareness changes everything. The empath feels the pattern immediately the same, pull the same energy drain, and quietly walks away. This is mastery, not avoidance. The unconscious no longer needs to repeat the lesson once consciousness has integrated it. At the psychological level, deletion transforms into discernment. The empath develops what Jung called the function of feeling, not sentimentality but evaluative intelligence. They can sense when something aligns with their soul and when it doesn't. They no longer confuse intensity with connection or chaos with chemistry. This is emotional maturity, the ability to choose peace over patterns. In many ways, deletion is the midpoint of individuation, the moment consciousness breaks free from collective conditioning. The empath no longer identifies with cultural ideals of unconditional love or self-sacrifice. They realize that wholeness requires differentiation, the courage to stand alone, to say no to disappoint others rather than betray oneself. Jung saw this as the birth of true individuality, the ego aligning with the self rather than the collective persona. Spiritually, deletion mirrors the alchemical process of separation, one of the key stages in Jung's interpretation of alchemy. In this stage, the elements of the psyche are divided so that they can later reunite in purified form. The empath's erasure is that separation. It's the soul dividing truth from illusion, self from projection, love from attachment. What remains afterward is pure essence consciousness purified through suffering. The empath begins to notice subtle miracles. Their intuition sharpens, their body feels lighter. Music, art, and nature touch them more deeply. Jung wrote that the withdrawal of projections allows the world to regain its sacred dimension. When the empath no longer uses relationships as mirrors, they can finally see life itself as the mirror of the divine. Every experience becomes meaningful not because it fulfills them, but because it reveals them. Erasure also heals the empath's relationship with time. In toxic attachment, time freezes every day, revolves around the other person's moods, responses, or absence. After deletion, time flows again. The empath begins to live in the present, rather than in anticipation. Jung observed that individuation restores a sense of psychic rhythm. Life becomes cyclical, organic, and self-directed. The empath no longer lives reactively. They live creatively. This freedom can feel almost sacred. The empath, once defined by their emotional entanglements, now experiences solitude as fullness. They no longer crave validation. They no longer fear being misunderstood. Their energy becomes sovereign. They are the center of their own psychic universe. Jung would say they've achieved a degree of self-realization, not perfection, but integration. The opposites within them, love and anger, compassion and boundary, coexist peacefully. Yet Jung warned that individuation never ends. The moment one believes they are healed, the psyche humbles them again. For the empath, new layers of awareness continue to emerge. They begin to see how even their act of deletion has symbolic meaning. It was not just about removing a person, it was about honoring the sacred law of psychic reciprocity. Love must circulate, not stagnate. When energy becomes one-sided, the soul intervenes. Deletion is the self's way of reopening that flow. In the broader arc of Jung's psychology, this act of erasure marks the passage from dependent love to conscious love. Dependent love seeks to possess, fix, or merge. Conscious love seeks to understand, witness, and release. The empath, through deletion, graduates from the former to the latter. They no longer need closure because they've internalized the truth. The only closure that matters is the peace of knowing you acted in alignment with yourself. Deletion is not the end of empathy, it's its evolution. The empath becomes what Jung would call a psychological adult, someone capable of love without losing themselves. They can care deeply and detach gracefully. They no longer use love as proof of worth nor silence as proof of strength. They simply embody balance. At this stage, forgiveness arises naturally, not as a moral duty, but as an energetic consequence of clarity. The empath realizes that resentment binds just as strongly as attachment. To truly delete someone means to delete the emotional charge they held over you. It means to stop narrating the story, to let it dissolve into neutrality. Jung saw forgiveness as a byproduct of understanding, not obligation. Once the lesson is integrated, the emotion loses its grip. The empath also learns that deletion doesn't require hate. In fact, true deletion is love in its highest form, love that respects free will. It says, I honor your path, but I will not destroy myself walking beside you. This is the compassion of the self, not the ego. It doesn't seek applause or understanding. It simply acts in accordance with inner truth. As the months pass, the empath may occasionally think of the deleted person, but there's no emotional spike, no anger, no longing, no pain, just calm observation. This neutrality is the evidence of healing. Jung would say the psychic energy has been reabsorbed into the self. The projection is gone, the lesson complete. Through this act, the empath becomes the alchemist of their own psyche. They've turned emotional lead into psychological gold. The wound that once defined them now fuels their wisdom. The pain that once enslaved them now serves as power. Deletion, once seen as an ending, reveals itself as transformation in disguise the moment consciousness reclaims its throne. And perhaps this is the hidden essence of Jung's erasure psychology. To delete is to remember who you are without the distortion of someone else's shadow. It is not escape, it is emergence. It is the moment the empath stops orbiting another's gravity and begins to shine from their own center. Part 4. The rebirth of the empath. The power of detachment. After deletion comes an eerie silence, not the kind that frightens but the kind that signals rebirth. When an empath severs ties with someone who once consumed their energy, the quiet that follows feels unnatural at first. Their psyche, once addicted to the highs and lows of emotional intensity, now faces a vast stillness. Yet in Jungian terms, this stillness is the threshold of transformation. It is what he called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to synthesize opposites and give birth to something new. The empath who has walked through the fire of awakening begins to feel different, almost unrecognizable. Their body carries less tension, their emotions no longer swing like a pendulum, and their mind stops rehearsing conversations that will never happen. The self, the central archetype of wholeness in Jung's psychology, is now taking leadership from within. The empath's previous identity, shaped by care, guilt, and attachment, is dying. What emerges is a being defined by inner equilibrium rather than external validation. Jung often wrote that every psychic death conceals a secret renewal. The energy that was once trapped in conflict returns in purified form. For the empath, this rebirth doesn't arrive through effort, but through surrender, the willingness to stop fighting reality. Detachment in this sense is not coldness. It is the serenity that arises when one accepts that not everything can be controlled, fixed, or even understood. The newly reborn empath begins to sense this detachment as a form of grace. They observe people's behavior without needing to interpret it. They witness others' emotions without absorbing them. They stop trying to rescue everyone from their pain. Jung would call this psychological individuation in action, the moment when the ego no longer identifies with collective expectations or relational roles. The empath is no longer the healer, the caretaker, or the understanding one. They simply are. This state of being is not apathy, it is mastery. Jung explained that true individuation always involves the reconciliation of opposites. The empath, once consumed by compassion, now integrates its counterpart, detachment. Compassion without detachment becomes martyrdom. Detachment without compassion becomes cruelty. The balance between the two creates mature love. The empath's rebirth, therefore, is not about losing their sensitivity, but anchoring it in consciousness. Detachment is often misunderstood as emotional withdrawal. But from a Jungian lens, it's the conscious choice to stay centered amid external chaos. It means refusing to let another person's unconscious dictate your state of being. It's the quiet power of saying, "Your emotions are yours, my peace is mine." In the early stages of this transformation, the empath notices subtle changes in their nervous system. The constant vigilance that once defined their existence fades. Their body, which had been braced for emotional storms, learns to relax. This is not merely psychological, it's somatic. Jung emphasized the interconnection between psyche and body, that the unconscious is not just a mental space, but a living organism within. The body begins to mirror the harmony of the soul. The empath's dreams shift too. Gone are the nightmares of chasing, fixing, or rescuing. In their place come dreams of walking through clear forests, crossing bridges, or standing before open water. These are archetypal images of renewal. The psyche is communicating. You are entering a new stage of being. Detachment gives birth to a rare kind of perception, one that sees beyond appearances. The empath begins to discern patterns in others without judgment. They sense manipulation before it takes form, feel dishonesty behind charm, recognize projection in a single sentence. Jung would describe this as heightened consciousness, the result of integrating shadow and light. Because the empath has confronted their own darkness, they can now perceive it clearly in others. Awareness replaces naivety, but this clarity also carries loneliness. The reborn empath realizes how many relationships were built on codependence. Conversations that once felt meaningful now feel hollow. They begin to prefer solitude over superficial connection. Jung noted that individuation isolates not because one becomes antisocial, but because one stops participating in collective delusion. The empath no longer confuses constant availability with love. They understand that sacred space is necessary for inner truth to breathe. In this solitude, something extraordinary happens. The empath's inner voice becomes louder than external noise. For years, it was drowned out by the demands of others, the endless noise of needing to please, explain, or prove. Now it speaks with calm authority. It guides decisions with intuitive precision. The empath discovers that their intuition had never left. It was simply buried under self-doubt. Detachment has cleared the channel. This inner voice often surprises them. It doesn't speak in guilt or obligation, but in simplicity. Go here, stop, let it go. Jung believed that this voice belongs to the self, the archetype that embodies divine wisdom within the psyche. The more the empath listens, the more life begins to flow effortlessly. Coincidences align. People appear at the right time. What once required struggle now happens naturally. This is the unconscious cooperating with consciousness, the psyche in harmony. The empath starts to experience love differently. It is no longer a hunger or mission, it becomes presence. They can sit with someone's pain without trying to fix it. They can love without fear of loss because they no longer seek possession. Jung called this the transcendent attitude, the ability to hold opposites, to love deeply while staying free. The empath's detachment transforms love from dependency into devotion, not to another person but to truth itself. In relationships, this new energy is magnetic. People feel the calm around them, the lack of demand. Yet those who feed on emotional chaos no longer find a home there. The empath's vibration, now steady and grounded, repels instability. Jung might say that the collective unconscious reorganizes around such an individual. The empath becomes a psychological center of gravity, radiating equilibrium. However, this new state of detachment is not effortless to maintain. The world constantly tempts the empath to regress. Old patterns reappear in disguise: a friend who guilt trips, a family member who demands constant attention, a partner who confuses closeness with control. But the empath's awareness acts as armor. They recognize the dynamic instantly. Instead of reacting, they respond with silence or clear boundaries. Jung described this as holding the tension of opposites, refusing to collapse into old reactions or new defenses. Detachment is not avoidance, it's strength restrained by awareness. The empath's rebirth also changes their creative life. Jung believed creativity is the natural expression of individuation, the psyche's way of communicating meaning through form. The empath, once drained by emotional labor, now channels energy into creation. Art, writing, healing, teaching, whatever form it takes, it becomes a sacred act. Creativity replaces chaos. Expression replaces obsession. The same sensitivity that once caused suffering now becomes a divine instrument. Another profound transformation occurs in how the empath relates to time and future. Before, their mind was constantly racing, replaying past wounds or forecasting future pain. Detachment brings them into the present. Jung saw the present moment as the meeting point between conscious and unconscious, the only place where transformation truly happens. The empath begins to notice details. They once missed the texture of light, the rhythm of breath, the feeling of being alive. They discover that peace was never something to find. It was what remained when they stopped fighting. This inner peace also changes their moral outlook. They stop labeling people as good or bad. They see instead levels of consciousness. Jung believed morality evolves as awareness expands from external judgment to inner understanding. The empath now views even the narcissist who hurt them not as an enemy but as a mirror of unconscious suffering. This doesn't mean they return, it means they release. Detachment is forgiveness without contact. Forgiveness in this context is no longer an effort. It happens naturally when emotional charge dissolves. The empath sees the entire journey, the pain, the manipulation, the awakening, as an intricate choreography designed by the self. Each experience was necessary for wholeness. Jung called this the teleological nature of the psyche, the idea that everything, even suffering, serves the purpose of individuation. The empath finally understands nothing was wasted. With this realization comes an expansion of compassion, but now it's grounded, wise, selective. The empath no longer gives to prove their goodness. They give from overflow, not depletion. Their energy is like a river that flows naturally, nourishes and continues, never stagnant, never forced. They have learned the most difficult lesson of all, to help only when invited, to love without losing themselves, to walk away without resentment. Detachment also brings a subtle joy, a quiet ecstasy. It's the joy of being enough within oneself. The empath wakes up one morning and notices they no longer crave validation, no longer fear silence, no longer feel the need to explain their peace. Jung would say the ego has finally aligned with the self. This alignment brings serenity, a state where external events lose their power to disturb the inner world. In daily life, this manifests as grace under pressure. The empath might face criticism or misunderstanding, but their response is calm. They no longer argue to be right. They understand that perception is projection. Jung's insight that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves now becomes their lived truth. Detachment has turned pain into perception. The empath's energy field becomes cleaner, and others can feel it. People start confiding in them, drawn by the silent authority that radiates from their presence. Yet the empath no longer carries others' burdens. They listen without absorbing. Their empathy now operates from the heart, not from guilt. They finally embody what Jung called the wise old man or woman archetype, the inner sage that guides without rescuing, teaches without preaching, and loves without clinging. As the empath integrates detachment, their relationship with their own shadow deepens. They no longer fear their anger or intensity. They know when to express it and when to let it pass. They no longer repress emotion. They observe it with awareness. Jung would see this as shadow integration at the advanced stage, emotion transformed into insight. The empath realizes that detachment is not suppressing feelings, it's owning them without being owned by them. This mastery of emotion leads to an even more powerful realization. The empath's strength lies not in feeling everything, but in choosing what deserves their feeling. Energy becomes sacred currency. Every response, every conversation, every involvement is intentional. They no longer chase closure or explanations. They live in alignment, and that alignment becomes their protection. In spiritual terms, detachment is the awakening of divine neutrality, the ability to witness life as it unfolds without labeling it as failure or success, gain or loss. The empath, having descended into darkness and returned with wisdom, now embodies what Jung would call the self's radiance. This radiance is subtle but unmistakable. It's in their eyes, their voice, their silence. It's the calm certainty of someone who has seen their own abyss and chosen peace. The reborn empath becomes a different kind of light, not the soft, naive glow that invites moths, but the steady flame that illuminates truth. They no longer fear loneliness because solitude has become communion with their inner self. They no longer seek validation because they've internalized wholeness. The dependency on external emotional drama is gone. They've outgrown the psychological need to be needed, yet their compassion remains immense only. Now it's discerning. They help from overflow, not from emptiness. They love because it's their nature, not because it's their duty. Jung believed that the individuated person radiates healing energy simply through presence. The empath has reached this level. They heal not by intervention, but by example. Their boundaries now operate effortlessly. They don't need to announce or defend them. The energy field itself speaks. You may approach, but you cannot invade. Jung would interpret this as the formation of a solid psychic container, the mark of individuation completed at the personality level. The empath's aura no longer leaks energy, it sustains it. This newfound state of detachment transforms how they interpret pain. They understand that suffering is not punishment, but instruction. Every trigger becomes a teacher, every disappointment a mirror. They no longer resist discomfort, knowing that growth hides behind it. Jung described this as the ability to hold the tension of opposites, staying conscious in contradiction until a higher synthesis emerges. The empath's rebirth is the embodiment of this wisdom. As this new consciousness stabilizes, the empath begins to feel connected to something greater than personal story, what Jung called the collective unconscious, the ocean of archetypal wisdom beneath individual existence. They sense life as a living dialogue between self and universe. Synchronicities multiply not as coincidences, but as confirmations that they are in alignment with the deeper order of being. This is the ultimate reward of detachment participation without possession. The empath can engage with the world fully in love, work, creativity, while remaining inwardly free. They've discovered that detachment doesn't mean absence, it means presence without fear. Their relationships reflect this evolution. The connections they attract now feel calm, honest, reciprocal. There is no performance, no fixing, no emotional chaos, only truth. The empath finally experiences love as it was meant to be, two whole beings walking side by side, not two wounds seeking completion. In this stage, gratitude naturally arises, not forced, not intellectual, a deep cellular gratitude for everything that happened, for the pain that woke them, the shadow that tested them, the silence that taught them. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." The empath now understands what that means. Detachment was not escape, it was becoming. Their perception of spirituality also changes. It's no longer about transcendence or escaping the human condition. It's about embodiment, bringing consciousness into every act, every word, every breath. Detachment grounds their spirituality in the ordinary washing dishes, walking in nature, listening to music. Every moment becomes sacred because they are fully present. This is what Jung meant by individuation as incarnation, the soul fully inhabiting the human form. Even their relationship with death transforms. The empath no longer fears endings. They've lived through too many psychological deaths already. They understand that death too is part of the cycle of individuation. It's not annihilation, but transformation. They carry this awareness quietly, without preaching, with a serenity that others can feel but rarely name. The power of detachment lies not in dominance, but in surrender. It is the paradox of strength through letting go. The empath, once enslaved by emotion, now uses it consciously. Once wounded by others' chaos, they now anchor peace. Once lost in projection, they now live in reflection. They have become, in Jungian terms, an integrated self, a being who contains both shadow and light, human and divine, compassion and distance. Detachment is their crown, not made of pride, but of peace. It is invisible, yet radiant, silent, yet unshakable. They've learned that love doesn't always mean staying, that kindness sometimes means walking away, and that the greatest form of empathy is refusing to participate in one's own destruction. The rebirth of the empath is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It moves quietly through the world, grounded, sovereign, and free. Jung would call this the final integration of the self, when the individual no longer seeks completion outside because they have become a vessel of wholeness within. And so, in this final stage of their journey, the empath realizes that detachment was never the opposite of love, it was the gateway to it. Because to truly love, one must first be free. When an empath deletes you, it isn't punishment, it's resurrection. They rise from the ashes of who they were, lighter, wiser, and whole. Jung said, "You meet your destiny on the road you take to avoid it." Every empath who learns detachment becomes a mirror of divine power, love without bondage, compassion without exhaustion, peace without dependence. If this message spoke to your soul, you're not alone, you're awakening. Subscribe for more depth psychology insights, because your evolution has already begun.